Thank you all, and thanks to Frank for sitting in for me. I had a little bit of an emergency to deal with. So I just want to remind the audience on the webcast that you can send questions online. We do have a way of taking your questions, and we would like to be able to bring those questions to our speakers. And so as a first question that I would ask, in the work that all of you do, you obviously are all recognizing in different ways that there are constraints, which I found to be kind of interesting. And that I think what I was hearing, Ed, from you is that to some extent you're constrained by the law at the NCHS, but also about what you think is right, whether you think is the correct approach. And so I just wanted to turn to each of you, but perhaps starting with Ed, whether you think that might be some fundamental principles that might be applied when considering requests for data. Are there that perhaps might apply across the board in different settings that at least that you have encountered in your own work?
Well, I'm happy to answer it, but in a way you might not like. It's that I think we really have it very easy because we are constrained by law. That drives what we're doing. And so we do not have any issues related to who's publishing first, okay? Or holding data under wraps so that someone can get first credit, or that one funder versus another, for example, can be ahead. For example, our NHANES study is funded by our direct appropriation, but a significant fraction of it is also funded by people across the federal government, other agencies. And we do not give one of those agencies a first crack, if you will, at results versus another agency. When they sign on, they know those are the rules. So somehow developing that kind of ethic or ethos around this may help outside of the relatively simple and cloistered world in which we operate. Because I know I personally have encountered this where we'll have demands from one agency or set of researchers, whatever, versus another who say it's absolutely vital that we have access to that information before anybody else. It's crucial. And, we've had to deal with that, but we have a very clear framework for dealing with it.
Is it not ever the case that the National Center for Health Statistics first publishes some of the data before it's made available to others?
No, what we do is we work so that if a result is published, okay, the information that went into that is published essentially at the same time, but that it's the very, very tip of the iceberg, okay? And that our constituencies, if you will, are also made available, may have that data made available to them, so that we don't do that. If we did that, we would have difficulty. We'd have difficulty functioning if when the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute, the National Cancer Institute, the Centers for Disease Control all contribute to something, okay? And they feel they also want to get credit for that. And what we do is publish it first under our name. We would have very little credibility to enlist their support in the future. So we work very, very hard and have suffered a number of slings and arrows over time because of that, where people say, you're really not being fair to us who have put up this amount of money for this. And we argue that we can't function that way.
So if I may, it seems to me you have a principle here that when you're involved in a collaboration, as you are, in a massive collaborative process, that there isn't a sense of precedence. All have contributed to the data. And you know, your data are clearly a federal government resource. And so perhaps that is one possible area, but are there other principles? I mean, I do know, because I have applied for the use of NHANES data, I've used it, that there is an application that one fills out. There is a review. It isn't simply, you know, downloadable. Some things are downloadable, but a lot of the data are not simply downloadable. There's a process for gaining access, especially if you want samples. But I don't know if that's generalizable into principles, or if that's just the way you think the law requires it, or.
Well, if people want to use the Research Data Center for NHANES, first of all, if they want to use NHANES, they can go on the website and use the public use data sets.
There are public use data sets.
Okay,
right.
and there's no hoops that you have to jump through other than understanding them. We have a extensive tutorial that the National Cancer Institute helped us develop that enables people to analyze the data. But if you want to use the Research Data Center, you do need to submit an application. And then we review the application. But it's extremely important to say, for me to say, that we do not review the application for its scientific worth. Now, some may disagree that we should do that. I feel strongly that we shouldn't do that. We review it, and we also don't review it in terms of how credible you are as a researcher. It could be some high school kid who is not competing in the Intel competition or whatever, who submits something. We look at it in terms of how feasible it is to do what they're saying they want to do, but not in terms of the result, actually achieving the result. Just if they say they want to combine one data set with another, does that data set exist? Is it possible to do that? And we want to be sure that there's no sense that this person wants to use the data to expose something, like de-identify it in some fashion. Okay? And I think it's important that we do that, and that we, as a federal statistical agency, not judge the research that's proposed on the basis of how good it is as far as science goes. Part of the principles and practices for these agencies is the data are available. We collect it, we make it available for free to everybody who wants it. Okay? And it would be violating that if we were to put the judgment of myself or someone else, or Peter Meyer, who's here, who heads the Research Data Center, that in terms of how valuable that piece of research is going to be. We do charge for the use of the Research Data Center, but we try to make those charges reasonable in terms of what people can afford.
The others, are there other principles that might be brought forward?
Well, there are a few that come to mind, and I want to broaden it out a little bit beyond just what the federal agencies do, because there are private enterprises that collect data and have data sets, et cetera. One which was mentioned earlier in the day is really the principle of, as early on in the process, right as you go to fund a study, whoever you are as a funding agency, expecting to build into the grant and into the proposal the plans for making data available at the other end, and the dollars that are going to be necessary to do that. I think we haven't done that uniformly. I think that has to be there, and it has to be there for anybody who's funding research in the private sector as well as the public sector. The flip side of that is something that also came up today, which is, it seems to me that we are almost going to have to declare some form of statute of limitations on how far back we can reach in data, in reaching the old data. I think you brought that up this morning, Lynn. Both for practical reasons, you know, floppy disks can't even be read anymore, let alone some of the other data formats that were being used at earlier times. but also because actually, and unless somebody can correct me, when we've gone back and looked at federal policies on how long data is supposed to be retained, it's not that long. It's 7 years of some sort. And I'm not just talking about internal data retention policies. I'm talking about grantees getting money. That's what we found. If somebody can point something longer than that, I'd be interested in doing that. But imagine that EPA is going to do a rule 10 years from now that will use a study that was finished 5 years ago, which they might well do. That's going to be a problem. And so I think there's this issue of how you negotiate that, how you establish that principle that we're just not going to get some of the data from this. That doesn't mean the study's invalid or can't be used. And so that's an important thing. I think the third thing I would mention is a combination of kind of if there's a principle of respect here that could be established, both for the investigator, the time they're going to have, what they've already put into this. The prior should be, this is a good scientist who did a good piece of work that got published in a peer-reviewed journal, not this is a scientist who has a data set that is going to be, that I can show is absolutely wrong. But the flip side of that is that the scientists, we need to create a setting where if somebody is looking at the data and is trying to ask questions about it, that they could pick up the phone and call the scientist, and the scientist actually feels they can answer the phone and respond. And that's not a simple, that respect on both sides is not going to be simple to do. So 3 principles there. One is the funding up front, making sure we have the data in practice in there. The second is this issue of the statute of limitations, and then the third is respect.
Linda?
So I guess one principle I haven't talked about much is the appropriate time. Not how long this data can be available, but the appropriate time for making data available for others to work at. There was a little talk this morning about the need that the data be curated and looked at carefully before it's released, but there are huge concerns. I know that our investigators have about premature release of data or premature demand for release of data before it is fully analyzed. And I don't mean analyzed for all the different endpoints, but to be sure that the data is accurately captured. I think that's a principle that really needs to be thought about.
Well, that slide that we saw earlier today, that there are all the data, and then there are the clean data, and then there's the clean data that were actually used, in the analysis. And what do people mean when they say they want the data? And certainly data cleaning, I would say, is very difficult to do, and even when it's your own work. I'm pretty sure National Center for Health Statistics doesn't release data that hasn't been cleaned. I mean, I would guess the quality control is done before it's made available to the public. And but I don't think that has been clearly articulated. I think it's a great point, Linda. I mean, what service do you do providing data that are not reliable? George?
I think the only thing that I would add is to build to that. I mean, so much of whether we believe in processed data is some sort of trust in what sorts of quality controls have been applied to both the data collection and the processing. And I think that might be something else that we would want to pay attention to as a principle, is that that this also needs to be standardized.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into that, but there are a couple of people at the. Oh, did you want to add something, Ed?
It struck me in hearing about reanalysis this morning. I heard a debate over the recent Canadian breast cancer data that came out, and the issue between somebody who's felt very strongly that the data were flawed, and the Canadian investigator really had nothing to do with the data per se, had to do with the quality, if you will, the way the data were actually collected. So it went back to what everyone wants to call it, the metadata, if you will, the actual structure of the study, which I think is very important, because I think reanalysis is one thing, but that means, in a sense, if you agree on the structure, then you're dealing over the, I guess, the analytic methods. But in many cases I've seen, the issue are not the methods per se. It really is how the data was actually collected from whom and what.
Which is kind of the point of replication. Do the study, again, in a different population. Reanalysis, hopefully you get the same answer over and over again, but it may not be the right answer just because, you know, every time you recalculate it, you get the same number. But anyway, Frank?
My question really is addressed principally to Dan, who pointed out that we have an adversarial system here with different values competing. And we do that in our society in all kinds of situations, and at times we have a system of deciding. We have a decider, we have a judge or a body. Even in the NSA cases, we have something of a judicial system to try to determine what are legitimate and what are less legitimate claims. And in this case, we have a variety of interests at stake, not only the public interest in science and the private interest in personal information, but the interest of the lead investigator, et cetera. So the question is whether, in your thinking about this, you have thought about a system where there would be a statutory or otherwise created system of adjudicating this adversarial system between the interests of research and the interest of privacy.
That's a nice, easy question to answer. You're absolutely right. I do think that, I mean, first of all, we do live, and issues, the reason there's so much attention to certain studies is usually because there are incredible policy and economic stakes involved in decisions that are based on those studies. And in a democracy and in an adversarial one, there should be ways for people who have concerns about that to raise their concerns. And we heard from the legal system first thing this morning. That happens all the time. EPA's rules get challenged all the time on a variety of factors, not just on the health basis. And as we heard, I think that often the discussion is not, was the underlying science done correctly, but rather how was it considered in a thoughtful and rational manner by the agency making the decision. And sometimes EPA loses and sometimes they don't, and sometimes OSHA loses and sometimes they don't, and you can go on from there. I think what I was calling for it, and I don't know if there's a way of doing this, and I doubt that there's a congressional way of doing this, is whether one could figure out how to construct rules of engagement that were promoted a level of civil discourse that enabled people to actually produce quality science, have it challenged by scientists, no matter who they work for, but in a scientific manner, have dialogue and opportunity for dialogue, and then in the end know something more than we did before as a result of that. And the reanalyses we did had some of those characteristics, but we were the first ones to say that shouldn't be what should be necessary in every single case for every single study. There just aren't the resources to do that. But I do think that how to create that, and the Academies is a place where that kind of discussion could occur. There are other settings where it could occur, where you could potentially at least get the core of people who are engaging in this to understand what is acceptable and what is not acceptable practice. Bringing a scientific fraud case against a legitimate investigator because you want to intimidate that person probably goes over that line. I think I could say that with some safety. On the other hand, asking to see the underlying data and do real analyses in it to understand what it is to go through getting it published in the peer-reviewed literature, even if you're advancing one of the adversarial sides, has the potential to be very positive if it's done in the right rules of engagement. So it's that, and I'm not quite sure. I clearly wouldn't trust this Congress, and I'm not talking one party or the other, to be the ones to determine what those rules would be. But I'm not sure. There was a group that Lynn and I were on a few years ago that wrote a report on advancing science for policy purposes that tried to lay out some of the principles. Whether it was the be-all and end-all, but it was one example of that, and there may be others.
So, actually this reminds me of, another area that's a possible kind of general principle, and you and also John Howard talked about the idea of setting up data enclaves or a place where people can access the data as you have. The federal government has many centers where people can go. And should that be extended to investigators who are funded by the federal government? Is it possible that that kind of an enclave could be a home where when you submit your paper, you could submit your data, and then you wouldn't have to worry about looking after this generation of technology, 30 years from now, somebody else would be responsible for keeping it as long as it ought to be kept, retaining it as long as keeping it up to date, keeping it available. And might that perhaps put that process at arm's length between whoever is trying to access the data and the investigator? I don't know if it's feasible, but Dan?
Actually, I think that's a really interesting point, and one of the issues that raises, which I just touched on, is that, if a federal agency itself has conducted a study, constructed the data sets, et cetera, and then chooses to either share its data through a data center or some other mechanism, there are a series of laws that people have to sign on data use agreements under federal law, not unlike yours, but there are also ones for NIH data sharing more broadly. I don't know that that's so clear-cut for a federally funded study at Harvard or Stanford or somebody else who has a data set. When I signed an agreement with Harvard, I didn't have a federal law that told me that in the same way. So one way to ensure if you could provide a safe harbor for that sharing, it's possible you could also deal with that issue at the same time, which is some mechanism where the people who are getting access to the data are signing on, as they do when they come to the research data center, to a fairly clear set of rules that if they violate them, there's a penalty.
Okay,
and
great.
That would help protect privacy.
Okay. I've got Ellen and Steve and Francesca maybe take other questions. Ellen, I think you've been up there longest.
I have one small point and then one maybe larger one. The other, on the issue of ontologies and language, I hope that you're working very closely also with Medline and PubMed, because I've just finished teaching a course on using PubMed. And since when we do systematic reviews and other ways of compiling information in the scientific world, we rely upon the ontology that's been constructed there, that if you come up with better ways of accessing the information that George talked about, that there'll be some way to translate this into a consistent analytic method of searching. But I think I'm feeling like I want to say something from my life as a first-grade scientist, as Tony Cox would say. I don't think science is advanced by reanalyzing data sets. Science is advanced by people replicating studies in different situations with different populations that are completely independent. I think we're kidding ourselves. This has very little to do with the quality of science. I don't think anything was advanced by extracting all the data from the Needleman studies, reanalyzing it 15 times, accusing him of fraud, and then moving on. What was advanced was having 11, 20 more studies. And as Francesca pointed out and others, what is advanced is not going back to the 6-city study, but it's the accumulation of better methods, analytic methods, statistical methods that hone in on the same question. That's how science advances. So could we stop saying that this is a matter of advancing science? We can say whatever you want to say this is all about, but it has nothing to do with advancing science. I would challenge anybody to show me where an analysis of existing data was as earth-shaking as doing a really fantastic study that looked at the same hypothesis and either replicated it or moved it forward into a different area. The other point is that I'm very concerned by the point that George made, which is in our field, we really don't have enough information. And certainly when we did our systematic reviews, and we did the one with Liz Mall down at NIEHS, what we ran up against was the paucity of information. And if you set in motion processes that are going to discourage generation of information, we'll be in a worse state. Now, maybe that's what some people want, for us to be in a fog of idiocy and ignorance so we can't make any steps forward. But those are really my two reflections as a scientist. This is not the way I was taught to advance science, was to demand somebody else's data set, reanalyze it. No, it was to look at something published and say, hey, you know, I don't think that's right. Then go out and think of another study. And anything that discourages the generation of knowledge has got to be seen as anti-scientific. And I guess finally, this whole culture of adversarialness is something, you know, that's really potentially very destructive of science.
Any responses to that?
Well, I said a minute ago that we who did a major reanalysis did not think of that as the major place where we should be spending our research dollars or scientific dollars. I will say that when properly constructed, as that one was in our view, there were actually new insights and not unimportant insights. The modifying factors of socioeconomic status on the effects of air pollution first reported in our reanalysis, not in the original studies. So there are opportunities to do that if you're not doing it in the adversarial arena. The second thing I would just say is science at its best is a highly adversarial undertaking, not for the reasons we're talking about, but because different scientists have different views of what's the right answer and what's the wrong answer. And what I was trying to say is, are there ways to move our political adversarial process in a direction where it is more like a scientific adversarial process? Because, you know, we have rabid debates among scientists over whether somebody's study is correct or not correct, and that goes on all the time.
Linda.
So the rabid debates is a whole other issue that I think was alluded to before, where there's too much going on right now of people talking past each other instead of actually listening to each other and hearing what people have to say, and finding out where there's agreement and where there's disagreement and going forward. There's too much of just oppositional kinds of stuff. And I want to second what Dan said, and Ellen, I think it really is in concert with what you said, is that when different people look at the same data, they may be asking sometimes different questions or additional questions. And that's how science moves forward too. But if the whole objective is just to be an I gotcha, that's where things break down totally.
Okay, Steve.
Steve Lamb. Ed, I'd like to add to your set of principles, and that is the principle of data correction. One of the things that I've been impressed with our NCHS does, particularly for the NHANES study, is that there'll be an improvement in the laboratory technique. You'll discover that some error was made in the laboratory 3 years ago. You correct the data. You put out an announcement that says, we've corrected this data. I have to compliment you, and I think that's a very well-deserved principle that you enunciate. Thank you.
Hard to argue with correcting.
I just want to comment on that. I think it's important, and I hope Ed isn't going to disagree with me, but when you develop new technologies, it's not that the old data was wrong, it was that you didn't have the technology to answer what you can answer now, and it's very important that that information be shared, but rarely do people go back and actually do reanalysis. For example, I'm thinking of, you know, in NHANES, in the report card where you're measuring the different chemicals that you might find in serum or urine. You know, we have levels of detection issues today much, much lower. So some of the detection of chemicals today that we're finding, say, in people, it isn't that they weren't there 20 years ago, it's that our methods weren't sensitive enough to detect them at the levels at which they were present. And I think it's important that people become aware of that.
Francesca.
Yeah, very, very quick. I really enjoy both Ellen and Dan. I think they have articulated the issue of actually what is the threat of making things reproducible and working in an adversarial environment. The point, I think I have just two quick points. One is that in environmental health, the low-hanging fruits, we don't have a low-hanging fruits anymore. We are now trying to understand whether smoking causes lung cancer. We are trying to assess whether or not, a concentration of environmental contaminants that fortunately are very, very low are still harmful to human health. To do that, it requires terabytes and terabytes of very, very complex data. And so I think everybody will agree with that. That means that there is really no study, and I'm also challenging even to say that if there is a single study that is right or is wrong. Every single study will have some things that are right, and every single study will have some things that are wrong, including mine, and I'm challenging everybody else who did the study. So as soon as you put these in an adversarial environment, as soon as you try to put a stamp on a study, it's right or it's wrong, automatically you stop the advancement of environmental health. So so that's one point, and the only way to move forward, because of the reality, and we're trying to assess effect of low concentration. I mean, unless it's strikingly obvious, but then we're not going to have that conversation because it's strikingly obvious, you don't need a lot of data to analyze it. The only way to move forward is to be collaborative, open mind, neutral, and without any minimum conflict of interest. The other thing that we really have to remind here are the young people, the student, postdoctoral fellow, assistant professor, the new generation coming in. And what I'm worried about is that if we are trying to further regulate environmental health, making additional administrative burden, additional demand of making your study reproducible, to make accountable about the multiple million decisions that you make every day to analyze terabytes of data, we're going to lose people interested in this science. And we're actually seeing a leaky pipeline of generation of new environmental scientists. So I could echo, a stronger note of caution of be careful, because in order to be adversarial, in order to have a discussion 20 years to analyze a single data set, we really jeopardize the advancement of environmental health.
Francesca, I was reminded by something Dick Jackson said during lunch, which is, listening to the discussion this morning, he would have a hard time recommending that anybody go into environmental epidemiology today. I just wanted to ask you a question about something you said about conflicts of interest. So, is that another principle? Should that be a part of the metadata? So that's something that we haven't really talked about at all, but information about the investigators who generated the data. What should be there? What should be there?
Yeah, I think this is, and I can be pretty bold. You can ask, every single paper that is published in a peer-reviewed journal, you can ask how much the investigator went on his pocket by producing that study. Most of the academic investigators are funded by the NIH, who funds 20% of their salary under their cap. So it's $170,000. We're very simple. I'll have no problem to put a dollar amount to every single paper that I write, as long as someone else that is an industry consultant is paid hours to write that paper, puts the same dollar amount. That would be another way to disclose in data, which I will be very, I think most of the academic will have no problem in disclosing how much money they make when they write a single paper.
So I want to comment, excuse me, on conflict of interest. I really think we need to move away from the term. I don't know how many people saw the editorial in Nature March 6th, 2 weeks ago. There was a call for full disclosure, because conflict of interest is really in the eye of the beholder or the individual. Disclosure is information that would be available to everyone. So, I've worked for the government for a long time, and I have no problem saying that. I don't really think I have a conflict of interest, but maybe other people, if I put, that I say that I work for the U.S. government, will feel, oh yeah, there's something that, this is important information for me to know. So I think it's absolutely important. There are lots of academics who, in addition to their NIH funding, may have funding from a variety of other sources, whether they be NGOs or they be industry, and I think it's absolutely essential that we begin to have that information fully available, just like, if somebody works for Dow, fine, I know who they work for, but if somebody is a consultant, for example, I don't know who's actually paying their bills frequently, and if anyone says that who puts the food on your table doesn't have some kind of impact on your gestalt, I'm going to find that hard to believe.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There were other comments up here. George? Yeah.
Mine wasn't on conflict of interest, but it was on, just to violently agree with your comment that the low-hanging fruit is gone, and that we're past the time of finding either one gene or one environmental agent that causes a disease. And so if we really want to make headway in public health, it's going to be through sharing large data sets. And I didn't want to speak just to echo your comment, but to say that I think that this also brings up another concept or principle that we ought to be considering, which is, there aren't any 100% positive aspects of data sharing, but I think what we have to do is get to the point where we can do the calculus that shows us that the benefits of the data sharing far outweigh whatever the costs are, and then figure out, if the costs are disproportionately borne by one individual or one sector, that we find ways to compensate them. I mean, to me, that's really what we need to be thinking about is the benefits.
Dan, and then I'll let you go.
So two things. One on the issue that came up both from Francesca and others about being right and wrong. We had in the early 2000s a very good example of an investigator. It was Francesca identifying that the statistics she had used were not quite correct in a major study that she had published and were used in 20 or 30 other studies. And we went through with EPA a major revised, I'm going to add a new word to this, revised analysis effort with new peer review and various other things to try and address that. But it was a very open, in fact, there was one industry person who said to me, so you mean that every number in the original study that she published was wrong? But that actually was a credit to Francesca, and I don't think the scientific community does that enough, actually. But this, not that you make mistakes enough, but if they find it that's there, I just wanted to credit that. The second thing I would just say, and maybe this is something that the results of this workshop could help. You tried this morning very well, I thought, Lynn, to lay out the definitions of reanalysis and replication and reproduction, and we as a group have managed to mangle those in an incredible degree. And I think I'd go back to what yours were, but but there is,
So Dan, why I think it's important? Because, and I think many of you know this as well, that when criteria have been developed for establishing causality,
right,
that it has been important to separately look at these issues.
That's right.
Because actually, a finding is far more convincing if it is reproducible than if it's just on reanalysis you get the same answer.
That's right.
That's not a not a replicable finding. It's just they did the math right. And I can't help but think that there's more that we're falling into that because it's easier to just recalculate. It's easier to reanalyze. But reproducibility is a much higher standard, right? So that's why I'm trying to be careful about the language, And
actually, if I could just within that, I totally agree that reproducibility, that is going to trying to test the same thing in other data sets. I mean, in fact, the ACS study, which some people know, was an attempt by Harvard to reproduce the Harvard Six Cities study in a different population. That's what that was. It was not a, but one clarification there. In order to reanalyze, i.e. to do all kinds of sensitivity analyses and other things, not just check the math, but the first thing you have to do is replicate the original results. You have to say, can I do exactly what they did in this data set and come up with the same thing, so I know I'm working on the same data set. Now I can go off, and reanalysis, I would say, goes much further than just checking their math.
I
it goes
realize
further.
that, but
Okay,
still, you
but
understand what I'm
you were
saying,
very
nonetheless.
close in your definition this morning. I think it's important, and I do hope that the roundtable and putting the results together could try and sort of clarify that and make it pretty important, because I think it would be actually a contribution to sort of sifting the data a little bit. So.
The ones on my slide were the Oxford English Dictionary, but not mine, just so, to be clear. Yes, Ed? To give credit where credit is due.
I was struck in the discussion of the adversarial nature of all of this in a science court. You didn't use those terms, but that the public also has some sort of a role in this. Not a direct role, but it needs to be well informed. And that means that that the media, there need to be some places in the media that are able to sort of distill this and get to the point where they can understand the issues. The public, that is, can understand the issues. And it's something, it hasn't come up, and it's something that I think we have fewer and fewer people in the media who really do a great job of this. There's some, but we used to have many more, at least as I see it. So I think it's a factor in this. The other point I wanted to make was, when George, when you were talking about the computing power, it's interesting that in different fields you see sort of parallel efforts. And in, I don't know what the field would be, I mean, I would call it sort of health research, but it's not environmental health research per se. There's a tool that's been developed over many years called Archimedes, and it draws information from distilled studies, small pieces of distilled studies that give little pieces of causality that are very well documented, that's solid, and is able to put it together into, let's say, a large model of diabetes, for example. And I don't think that we're making use of that type of thing. So I think you made a very good point. You had a decision tree, but there is much more that one could do to embed within that tree to give insight. And you just don't get all that much insight, I think, from looking at confidence intervals, in the summary at the end of a study published in the New England Journal. I think you need more than that.
Hal?
Yeah, Hal Zinnick, EPA. I want to be a little bit left field. What's new? One of the things we haven't talked about is the incentive for data sharing. And if you look at the baby boomer cohort, which I'm part of, this is a foreign concept. During our careers, it was a very competitive type of atmosphere. So you published was your metric, publications, presentations, funding were all based upon competing. If we fast forward about 20 to 30 years, we have a whole new cohort here. And that cohort lives social media. All they do is data share, back and forth. But the incentives for that haven't emerged. So even if they're successful in data sharing, what are the metrics? Publications, funding, number of presentations. Not the metrics you'd like to know is what did you accomplish by data sharing. So maybe a side discussion would be, what would those begin to look like? Did data sharing help advance what you were going to produce? Did it help advance the impact, the utilization of it, and so on, which are totally foreign to us. And I'm concerned that if we move this discussion forward and don't move that discussion forward as to why they would do this is your pipeline issue, then we'll have a huge gap that will be very, very difficult for us to overcome. So just offer that as an observation.
Okay. Well, in fact, I believe, and I think Andy is here and he might be able to address that, I believe that at this point in time, because of the way data sets are being used by people online, I don't know, I'm not going to say younger people because I think older people are doing it too. I don't want to blame the younger generation for this. That actually states are taking steps to make the data less available because there's been a lot of data mining from data sets that used to be more available, but now are being used for so many different purposes that people are becoming more concerned about their personal privacy. I don't know, Andy, if you could address that at all, but I actually see this as as an issue for those of us in public health, that some of the data that used to be accessible are actually becoming less accessible. But not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I would have I think what's happening is the data sharing in states used to be much more naive and trusting. And I think that era has begun to go away, that there's enough, a challenge that we haven't had to address here is state public health powers are exceedingly broad, and we would never get that kind of legislation if it weren't, constitutionally derived within most of the states. So we get access to data without confidential data, without the participants having to give informed consent. And the challenge with all of our administrative databases, and I would say birth defects registry, and now we get into trauma registries, all of these where it's a mandatory reporting of data, what everybody wants to do is now link it to something. And so keeping the confidentiality of it, and for those of you who've made an attempt to link data such as childhood-led registries, which go back many years, with school test result outcomes, you're running up against FERPA versus HIPAA versus the other. And while it's a technically very easy thing to do these days, it's like death registry, you just send in the information and they'll find if the person is died. Well, it's not quite that easy, but the way you used to have to do the searches is quite different. So I think what has happened is greater attention and concern on the legislative and the public side about sharing of this type of data and what's in it and how it changes. So that I think you're right, but I think it's mostly that health departments have kind of come up to speed to be more modern in the requirements for data use agreements and things like that. But again, the public health linkage issue is really a problematic one that is difficult, that we're trying to deal with.
Thank you. Any other last thoughts from members of the panel? Parting thoughts? If not, we're going to go ahead and take a break. And I think that we're scheduled for let's see, 20-minute break? Okay. So we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you.